Your money is changing value. Well, of course, it's constantly changing value. Ever since 1971, we have had currency across the world that is fiat currency. It's not actually tied to anything of value, so it just kind of floats. And a lot of people don't understand that concept, and that's what this video is all about, so that you understand what inflation does to your money. Governments have always made you think that inflation is a good thing. Well, it's exactly the opposite. It's a bad thing. Deflation is actually a good thing for you and a bad thing for government. So there's a reason that they try and keep all of this information under wraps, because if you found out what they were doing to you, you'd be pretty unhappy. That's what you're going to find out if you don't know very much about inflation and deflation. So your money is constantly changing, and it's going to change in a big way going forward. And I want to introduce this concept to you of deflation because it's very important to your future, and even economists don't understand it because we've never really had it during our lifetimes to any great degree. We had a little bit of it in the 1970s, but really it was pretty small compared to where we're going. So let me give you an idea by doing a little bit of an analogy. You know, when I was in my early 20s, I lived in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and I went to university at Ryerson University, which was downtown in Toronto, and next door to a kind of a seedy little area, Church and Jarvis, and sort of the east side of the city, and we often had to go out and buy beer. So Canadian beer is you get a 24 pack typically in those days, and that would cost you in 1971 it was $5 for 24 beer, and it was Canadian beer. Hey, that's a good thing because Canadian beer has a lot more alcohol in it than U.S. beer, for example. But that was 1971, and I can remember walking 4 blocks in the dead of summer and hauling this thing back, because these were bottles, it was pretty heavy, hauling it all the way back to my dorm. And that was a pretty big deal, and I'd have to rest on just about every block because they're pretty heavy. $5, big deal. Every bottle was worth 20 cents. Well, contrast that to today. $45 now for a 24. That is inflation at work. So it's actually 9 times the price that it was 38 years ago. $45 for the same bottle of beer. I mean, the beer hasn't changed. So what is going on here? The beer sort of has the same value, and yet the price is 9 times or 900% what it was 35 years ago. Well, that's inflation. And the thing that you have to understand about inflation is that it's actually not the beer that's changing, it's the money that's changing. So the beer stays, it's the same beer, but what you're doing is you're giving them more money for that beer. So what does that mean? Well, it means your money is not worth what it was 38 years ago. It's worth a lot less. And so it's getting that concept across. You think about housing, for example, that's gone through the roof, and houses are very expensive now to purchase. And they've gone up a huge amount in value. In about 1990, I think, I bought a house for $250,000, which eventually today is worth about $1 million. Well, that's a huge difference. But the house itself, because it's that much older, is actually depreciated in value, but the price has gone up just because the money is less expensive, or less valuable. So you have to give more dollars to get the same house. So for example, 100 years ago, and I'm going to show this in a chart, 100 years ago, the dollar was worth $1, like 100 cents, but through inflation, it's now worth about 4 cents to what it was 100 years ago. So therefore, houses are going to go up in price because people don't want you to give them 4-cent dollars when the house was actually built in a time where they had 100-cent dollars, and you'd be getting away with murder. So they're asking you to give them a lot more money to make up for that 94 or 96% difference in the value. So we'll get into that as we go. But the big deal was before 1971, when Nixon actually delinked the dollar from gold, gold was actually linked to the dollar. So money was pretty stable. It didn't change in value very much anyway. So money in the US, for example, after the war, they decided that the US dollar would be the reserve currency and that all the other currencies in the world would get pegged to that dollar and at their own individual values, and that the dollar would be pegged to gold, so that every time you went to the bank, for example, you could actually get $35 worth of gold, which would at that time be an ounce of gold. You could buy that for $35, and banks were required to give that to you. So you had actual value for the money. Gold didn't change in value. So that was before 1971. And then in 1971, because the government had been inflating, which meant that money or currency was getting less valuable, and so people would still go in and buy $35 worth of gold. Well, when currency gets less valuable, gold goes up in price. So the government was losing money on their gold because people were trading in their dollars that might be worth 90 cents on the dollar at that time in 1971, and getting gold that they would be able to get more. The gold was more valuable than the money that they were giving for it, because the gold was pegged at $35 to the dollar, and the dollar was only worth maybe about 90 cents of what it was 10 years earlier. So that became a problem. So he delinked gold from the currency, and that meant that it's not pegged to anything. And what happens is that it can just float. And so the value changes over time. Let's look at the price of gold today. And you'll find that this is a chart of gold. It's a 3-day chart of gold. And you'll find that it's up at $1,800 US. Gold is priced in US dollars. So what does that mean? It's gone from $35 to $1,800. Well, gold is still the same as it always was. In fact, it hasn't increased because you don't get that much gold out of a mine, so it really hasn't increased in terms of the amount of it that's around. It stays pretty stable on its own. But what's changed is the value or the price of money. It's actually the value of money. So now they're not going to sell you gold for $35. They want a lot more of your money. They want 1,800 of those dollars to pay for the same thing. You get an ounce of gold that used to cost $35 that is now $1,800, and that is the effect of inflation. So the government has actually made your money a lot less valuable than it used to be. And why do they do that? Well, governments are always trying to sell their products to other countries, and they're always competing against other countries, like, for example, Mexico. Let's take an example. Let's just say we were selling Frisbees to the U.S., and Mexico also made Frisbees. Well, Mexico might be able to make their Frisbees for less money in Mexican pesos than we could in Canadian dollars. So we want to sell more Frisbees at a better price to the U.S. So what does the government do? If it can lower the actual value of the dollar, then of the Canadian dollar, and sell them for less, we will sell more product, more Frisbees to the U.S., and those will give us bigger numbers in Canada. So it's just like a business. So if I was able to lower the price of the Frisbees because we lower the value of our money, then I'll sell more and I will get a bigger check from the US. And when the government does that, if they can show bigger profits on an annual basis, which we call GDP, then they can go to the bank like any business and borrow more money. So they can borrow against the money that they make as a country from selling product. And that is money they're borrowing against the Canadian people and the actual money that they pay in taxes. And I don't want to get into it any deeper than that. But the government likes to have lower value money because they can sell more product. And they also make more money from that, but that gets into another subject, which we'll handle at a different time. So that's the reason that the government likes lower currency values. And so they're constantly striving to do that. Now, over time, as I've said, your currency actually changes value. If we look at this graph, or call it a chart, whatever you like, this is the American dollar, but it could be any currency. So when the government inflates, it does the same thing to currencies all over the world, and governments are always competing against each other to try and get their currencies lower so they can sell more products. So it's a kind of a race to the bottom, and that's what happens. If we look at 1913 here, which was when the Federal Reserve was founded, let's say the dollar was worth 100 cents at that particular time. So it was at full value. Here you can see that from 1913 on down into about 1920, there was a huge amount of inflation. And then all of a sudden in the 20s, it deflated. So it lost its value coming down here, and then its value went up. So I said to you that we always have deflation during a depression. 1929, of course, was the depression that lasted through most of the 30s, 1930s. And you can see that it went up. Starting in the 20s, we started to get deflation, and that's what's happening actually now. We're actually starting deflation, and when we have our depression, which is coming, in the next year or so, technically, then we are going to see a great big rise in the value of our money. And that's what you're seeing here. And then at the beginning of the war, it's about 1937, 38, you see that we started to inflate again. And here's 1970, where you see this really pick up, and we really lost the value in our money. And now we're at about 96% less value in the dollar. So that means it's 4 cents of what it used to be 100 years ago. Well, what does that mean? It means when people build a house, they want you to pay an awful lot more dollars for it because the value of the dollar is now so little. And that's why, a house that was $20,000, 100 years ago, that would be a very expensive house, would be worth a couple of $1 million at least now, or even more, because the value of the house hasn't changed. And in fact, if nobody's done any upgrades to it, it would actually have less value because it depreciates. It's like driving a car off the lot. But we want more money for it because money is what has lost its value. Okay, so I'm hoping I'm making that clear. So there's another aspect of that is the supply and demand, which I had mentioned as well. So why does money become less valuable? Well, if there's a lot of anything in the economy, and money is the same, then it becomes less valuable. If there's not that much of it, then it becomes more valuable. So let's just take something you'd be familiar with. Let's say a Sony flat screen TV. That may not be the big brand these days, but just shows my age. But anyway, let's say that they had just come out and there's only, 100,000 of them. But there's 500,000 people that want them. So they can charge just about anything they want for that. The demand is very, very high. So you've got a lot of money in the economy. The demand is very, very high for the TVs, but people will pay that price because there's lots of money in the economy. There aren't that many TVs, so they're perceived to be more valuable. But, 10 years later, once we've made millions and millions of these TV sets, these flat screens, and they're in every store, then they become less valuable because you've got all these stores competing against each other to sell these TVs. So companies have to make them cheaper and cheaper and use less expensive products, and actually the quality goes down of those TVs, but the price also goes down because there are so many of them, and they're kind of like a dime a dozen, quite frankly. But what happens when we all of a sudden get into a depression? There's not enough money around for those TVs, and therefore the price of the TVs goes down even more because you've got all of these stores that have all of these TVs, and there's not enough money out there to buy them, so they're having to discount the TVs. So money is very much like TV sets. When there's a lot of it in the economy, when everybody's happy and the economy is doing well, money is actually less valuable. It's being inflated away. When there's less money in the economy, and a lot of people are losing their jobs, you're getting mortgages that are going belly up, and people are losing their homes. There just isn't that much money in the economy, and you'll find that prices start to go down because people aren't able to sell houses because not very many people have that kind of money. And so the money is what's going up in value. The price of the houses goes down. So that is kind of the yin and the yang of this. Money is constantly changing value. It's not the house, it's not the beer, it's not the gold. They stay stable. It's the money that changes value. And that's the key thing about deflation. In the good old days, they used to inflate money as well, but they did it in a different way because they were dealing with coins. They don't have the digital money that we have today. So what they would do in Rome, if we look at their actual money, so this is in 240 AD, past the top of the Roman Empire, but you can see that we had silver in all of the coins, and there was about a 40% fineness to the silver. So that meant that about 40% of the coin, let's just say it was 40% of that coin was silver, and then other metals made up the rest of it. So it was fairly valuable. It actually had silver in the money. Then you went on to 250. 40% fineness in about 250. 10 years later, it went down to 30% fineness. So the government started taking silver out of the coins. And you can see how they looked pretty awful too. So another 10 years, 20%, and you get down to 270 AD, and they took out so much, the coins look terrible, and there's just very little silver, 5%, fineness less than 5%. And so you can see that the government actually made more money this way. And what happens also as this goes on in time, people start to hoard money because they keep their silver coins that were worth more, and they use these in their daily life, but they'll start to hoard these. And so there becomes less money in the economy, and eventually the inflation will arrest and start to become deflation over time. But this ruins the economy because over a long period of time, because you get more money in the economy, but it's worth less, and that sends prices up, and you get the same thing that is happening today. In fact, that's one of the things that caused Rome to fall apart. There were many things, but certainly the money. So the point is that governments do this over and over and over again. In all the cycles that I talk about, every 172 years after we have a depression, money becomes more valuable again. And then over the next 172 years, the government inflates it away so it's worth nothing. And then we have another depression, and then it becomes worth something again. So this goes on over and over and over again, just different methods of doing it. But the government inflating is as old as time. They just do it over and over and over. So let's look at that house that might have been worth $250K in the year 2000 and would be worth probably close to double that. The inflation that we've had is pretty spectacular. So it might be worth an awful lot more today. And the house is sitting on a hill. Nobody's done any work on it. So the actual value of the house is less, but the price is now gone up. And what has changed? Well, the price has gone down in value, but the thing that's changed is money is worth a lot less than it was in the year 2000. They've inflated it away so that anybody can get more money for this house. They demand more money for this house because your money ain't worth what it used to be. And that's the fact. So that is what happens with your money. And over time, once you get into this deflationary cycle, this is how it works. We, over time, lose confidence in the value of our money, for example. And then so we stop spending. And so what happens with that? There's less demand for products. And that means that you get layoffs. If you get less money coming into a company, they're going to start to lay people off. So you get layoffs that happen. Then people that are laid off aren't able to pay their mortgages, and so you get mortgage defaults, and those loans go bad. And so that money actually disappears out of the economy. So that means there's less money in the economy. And when you get mortgage defaults, banks stop lending because they're scared of people defaulting on their mortgages. Usually the economy goes bad and banks stop lending. So if banks stop lending, again, no more money is going into the economy, so there's less money in the economy. People are starting to have cash flow problems, and companies are having cash flow problems because they can't pay their bills because banks stop lending. In fact, there's starting to be companies or banks that are pulling back loans. And that becomes a problem. Then you get bankruptcies that happen and companies go under and people start losing their jobs big time. And so we start to lose more confidence in the economy. And then we stop spending because we're worried about the cash that we've got. And therefore prices start to go down because businesses can't get people to buy their product because there's just not enough money in the economy. So money is becoming more dear, harder to get hold of. It's going up in value. And so this becomes what we call the deflationary cycle. And it goes on and on and on. And so people just stop buying, prices go down. And so you want to start buying at the bottom of the market, not at the top. So the big lesson to take away from this is that cash is going to be king going into the future because cash is going to become more valuable. Gold is going to go down against that in price because if your money becomes worth, let's say it's 4 cents now, if it goes up to become worth 50 cents of the original, 100 years ago, then you don't have to pay as many dollars for that house or that car. So those prices are going to start going down, and you're going to have a lot of companies that aren't able to sell enough of them because the cash just isn't out there. People don't have the money. So again, it's that deflationary cycle. Prices are going to get less and less and less for all assets, building, cars, services, virtually everything. So if you hold on to your cash and you make sure that the banks don't have it, because we're going to get a lot of bank failures eventually as well. So that's one of the things I'm going to be talking about going forward. Next month, I'm actually going to be working on give you a video on how the banks work, and that's a great big Ponzi scheme. So just hold on for that one. So over time, when your cash, as your cash in a deflationary environment becomes more valuable, maybe we're going to see in 5 years that beer will start being $5 again. I don't know. But this is one of the things you can look at commodities and see what's happening with them. And we should see energy prices going down because the demand is both going down and also the value of our money is going to go up. So you're going to be able to buy an awful lot more. You just want to get out of, if you want to be in cash. So that means it makes sense to sell your home if you don't need to live in it, or if you've got an extra home, now might be the time to do that because this is not going to turn around anytime soon. You might want to sell, you don't want to be buying a new car. That is a no-no because it will depreciate an awful lot in value, and the prices of those are going to go down astronomically over the next 5 to 10 years. So that's the story of deflation and inflation. We've had inflation for at least 100 years, ever since the 1930s, and we had a little bit of a blip in the 70s when we had the Great Recession. But for the most part, people have been living with inflation for a very long time. Now we're going to go into deflation because we got a credit problem. We have so much debt. And so banks are going to stop lending, mortgages are going to go under, people are already losing their jobs. You can see that from the coronavirus that we've had. That's going to continue because of the economy and because of the debt. It's really the economy and the debt that has done that, but the virus has exacerbated the problem. So you're going to, the key is hang on to your money. Make sure that you know where it is, and later on I'm going to be talking to you about being very careful with banks because there are certain banks that you want to frequent and other ones that are probably not going to be good banks to keep your money in because we are going to have some defaults, and we want to make sure that we get our money out in a safe or somewhere really safe before all of this stuff hits the fan. And I think that's going to start in earnest in about a year and a half, that sort of thing, where it's going to get a little bit crazy. There's going to be an awful lot more mortgage defaults than we have now, and it's not going to be a pretty picture. So stay safe out there and hang on to your cash.